Okay, all right. Today I'm going to read from Necessary Trouble, Growing Up at Mid-Century by Drew Gilpin Faust. You may recognize the title as a quote from the late John Lewis, who advised get into good trouble, necessary trouble. Um, Faust is a distinguished American historian. She's the author of Women of the Slaveholding South and This Republic of Suffering, an exploration of how the United States' understanding of death was shaped by high losses during the Civil War. She was the first woman president of Harvard University, serving from 2007 to 2018, when she replaced Larry Summers, who got into some unnecessary trouble um, by giving a speech in which he said the reason that there were not very many women in science and engineering was because they lacked higher aptitude. So the reason she became president of Harvard relates to the reading that I'm going to give, which I hope will resonate with women of our generation. Um, she was not only the first woman president of Harvard University, she was the first Southerner to become president of Harvard, and she was also the first non-Harvard graduate to be appointed as president of Harvard. So I'm going to read excerpts from the beginning of her memoir, where her first necessary trouble was her relationship with her mother. And I warn you, this is not a humorous story. It's a rather poignant and sad story, but I hope you will find it interesting. A Death in the Family, Christmas 1966. I still have the bracelet, and I feel it is somehow not rightfully mine. Under ordinary circumstances, I suppose I might have eventually inherited it, but my mother never even saw it. When she died on Christmas Eve, her parents gave what they intended to be her gift to me instead. I would wear it day and night for months, my own version of a traditional mourning band. We woke up that next day in a house overflowing both with presents and with stunned, disbelieving grief. My mother had wrapped most of them, and as we eventually opened each package, they seemed less objects than posthumous messages, representations of what she thought had mattered to us, a final gesture of love. Mounds of newly fallen snow left by the previous day's blizzard surrounded the house, making it difficult to get in or out of the long driveway and muffling any sound from the farm animals huddled around the barn or from cars on the highway beyond the woods. We spoke in whispers as well, astonished by the strange white world that enveloped us and by the strange new motherless world we inhabited. I had returned home from college only a few days before, prepared for the confrontation with my mother that I knew was inevitable. We had had a terrible fight about whether I could go visit a friend in Connecticut before I came to Virginia for the rest of the holidays. She insisted I had to have a letter of invitation from his parents before I would be permitted to go. I thought this preposterous, accused her of living in the Middle Ages, and went to Connecticut. I don't think I even told her that my friend was Black and that I had met him as part of a civil rights initiative in Birmingham, Alabama, 2 summers before. It could have only escalated the battle. But by the time I got home to Virginia, she had no fight in her. She was in bed, and I remember crouching down beside her to talk about plans for Christmas. She barely responded. We never settled the argument. and we never settled the larger argument that was what we had instead of a relationship. At a reception after her funeral, a neighbor approached me and grabbed a handful of my long straight hair, which had served as grounds for many of our mother-daughter fights. "You killed her, you know," she spat. I smiled politely and turned away as she returned to the bar. But I thought to myself, at least I didn't kill me. I knew I had had no choice. I had had to fight my mother in order to survive. And I knew too that in some way her failure to fight for herself, for a self, had contributed to the tragedy that was her life. I wonder now if my mother was an anorexic. At the time of her death, she was 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed no more than 90 pounds, although neither the word nor the concept of anorexia existed in our minds in 1966. She hardly ate, chain-smoked Camels, and consumed what must have been a significant proportion of her caloric intake in whiskey, ritual old fashions before and after dinner. But apart from tobacco and alcohol, she seemed determined to deny herself all pleasures, to make it her purpose to sacrifice herself for children and marriage. She had been a legendary horsewoman. She cut a figure mounted side saddle and met my father riding to hounds. There are glorious photographs of them side by side on horseback early in their marriage. She turned out in full riding habit, and the two of them almost glistening, just as the horses and even the saddles and bridles shone. But my brothers and I have no memory of ever seeing my mother on a horse. She gave it up along with tennis and sailing and so many other pursuits she had enjoyed as she focused increasingly on us. As we entered our teens, we three older children wished avidly that she would find some outlet to replace her all-absorbing interest and interventions in our lives. But for my mother, there was no ready alternative. I remember discussing with my older brother whether we might persuade her to get a job, but she had never been educated nor expected to work, and indeed, not one of the other mothers in our social circle was employed outside the home. The conventions that shaped her upbringing and the social constraints on middle and upper class women of the 1950s had left her living a life through her children. I'm going to summarize the several pages after this, in which she tells about her mother coming from a wealthy New Jersey family. She had attended a private girls' school but had dropped out before graduating from high school, not interested in academic study. Faust's father was from a prominent Virginia family from Clark County, sort of outside the Washington, D.C. area. And the family bred and sold thoroughbred racehorses. He was a student at Princeton, and when he went on a fox hunt, he saw this dashing young woman riding side saddle and fearlessly jumping fences and walls and ditches, and he was quite taken with her. They were married in 1942, and after the war, they moved back to his home place in Virginia to raise their family. And that's where I'm going to pick up with the reading. My mother was deeply unhappy in the 1950s Virginia. It was a place of roles and rules, of revered traditions and rigid expectations, not entirely removed from slavery times. An easy day's drive from where she had grown up in New Jersey, this was nevertheless in many ways a world apart. She had come to a community with a sizable Black population, whom she encountered as cooks, cleaners, and menial laborers. A white majority controlled every aspect of the local social and economic order. Segregation was mandated by Virginia law, and the unfamiliar details of racial etiquette and hierarchy were customs she needed to learn. In the suburbs of New York, she had not had to think about being white. But this was the South, and my mother had joined one of the families who regarded themselves as local gentry, with the privileges and presumptions that entailed. I cannot imagine my mother ever read The Feminine Mystique. It did not even appear until 1963, just 3 years before her death, when it quickly sold more than 1 million copies. But much of what Betty Friedan characterized as the problem that has no name describes my mother and her life. The sense of dissatisfaction and of yearning for something beyond the era's ideals of domestic bliss, the distorting and destructive effects of living one's life through one's children, the dangers of what Friedan called the forfeited self. Friedan describes the aggressive energy a woman should be using in the world that becomes instead the terrible anger that she dare not turn against her husband, is ashamed of turning against her children, and finally turns against herself until she feels as if she does not exist. Reading those words now, more than a half a century after my mother's death, I think of my unhappy and so often angry mother growing thinner and thinner until the day she indeed did not exist at all. I am sure she loved her children, but I am less sure she liked or enjoyed us, especially me. My birth had been followed in 1950 by the arrival of my brother Donald, and then in 1956 by Lou. I think Lou was something of a surprise, although national surveys indicated that since 1940, notions of the ideal number of children had risen from 2 to 4. But I was the only daughter, and I became the especial target of my mother's strongly held notions of how things ought to be. We were on a collision course from as early as I can remember. I needed to learn to be a lady, with the assumptions of decorousness, docility, and social position that destiny prescribed. I was not meant to become a woman, for that category carried dangerously sexual and sensual implications. It was a term that seemed almost impolite in its emphasis on the physical aspects of female identity, rather than the acquired graces by which a lady was defined. Black people were women. I must be a lady. The first fights were about clothes. I was only 2 or 3 when I declared war against fancy pants, frilly panties with lace ruffles she intended for me to wear on top of my regular underwear. They itched and seemed unnecessary, and I would have none of them. Why did so many fabrics for little girls have to itch? What torturer could have invented the organdy of the pale pink dress I was required to wear for a portrait painter when I was 4? I can still feel the discomfort of those little bouffant sleeves as I was instructed to sit still for what seemed like hours on end. Why couldn't I just wear a cotton shirt like my brother Donald, who was painted at the same time? The portrait was completed in spite of my attempts at resistance and my incessant wiggling. But I detest pink till this day. It has always seemed to represent a way of controlling and trivializing girls. Clothes battles became gender battles. What boys could wear, what girls had to wear. What girls couldn't do, what boys could do. It isn't fair became my constant refrain as I challenged what seemed to me so against logic and justice. It's a man's world, sweetie, my mother routinely replied, and the sooner you figure that out, the happier you will be. I should recognize and accept as she had the world as it was. She spoke with both resignation and no little anger, which she regularly yet inadvertently signaled with a clenching of the jaw that betrayed to her children more of what she was feeling than she intended it to. As I progressed in school, it became clear that I was an excellent student, at the head of my class all through elementary school, a voracious reader, filled with questions and curiosity about how the world worked. For my mother, this was unsettling. It made me not only very unlike her, but also unlike what she thought I should be. Years later, the counselor at my high school would capture the essence of our long-standing mother-daughter differences, citing in a college recommendation Mrs. Gilpin's bewilderment in connection with Drew's intellectual gifts. The counselor went on, Mrs. Gilpin is like a hen that has hatched a duckling and cannot understand having a daughter who is not going to be a Southern belle. To my mother, it was not only dangerous for girls to have good minds, it was also unnecessary, even wasteful. I once overheard her observing to a friend that she wished that my older brother, who struggled a bit with dyslexia, had been the one to inherit my brain. My mother praised me when I collected the class scholarship prize each spring, but she urged me not to attach too much significance to it or to act too proud. Other aspects of life, she insisted, mattered far more. In the child-rearing language of the day, she made it clear that it was much more important that I be well-adjusted. I heard that to mean compliant. At that, I consistently failed. Determined, opinionated, I was far more interested in animals and the outdoors than I was in dolls and clothes. I joined the 4-H club to raise steers with the boys, not to can and bake with the girls. I was convinced I often understood things faster and better than others, and I would argue insistently to defend my ideas. I wasn't much more than 2 when my grandfather dubbed me Little Miss Fix-It, after a cartoon character who was always telling others what to do. My mother urged me to lower my voice, not to speak like a fishwife, to soften my insistence, not to be so bossy, to defer more to others. I was well aware of my deficiency in the girl arena. I remember my feeling of relief when I answered the phone in our kitchen in April 1956 to learn that my 3rd sibling had just been born and was a boy. I had dreaded the prospect of a little sister and a lifetime of negative comparisons. As I grew older, the gap between boys' freedoms and girls' rules became even more stark. Girls were seen to be at risk and needed to be both constrained and protected. Ladies had to be defended both from themselves and from others as they became sexual beings. But my mother almost never talked directly about sex. When I first got my period at age 11, she had not yet mentioned menstruation or addressed the facts of life with me. The morning I told her about the blood on my pajamas, she belatedly and awkwardly began to try to explain. But I had long since educated myself with friends at school. Embarrassed for us both, I dismissed her and turned away. Our exchanges about sex were always perfunctory and vague, focused exclusively on the prohibitions that surrounded it and the dangers it entailed. But we argued incessantly and angrily about the regime of oversight and control the risks of sex seemed to require. Chaperones had followed her throughout her adolescence and young womanhood, and she expected the same surveillance regime to be in place for me to ensure both that I didn't behave inappropriately and that others didn't take liberties with me. One ongoing battle of my teenage years involved driving at night once I got my license. My older brother could go wherever and whenever he wished, but if I drove after dark, I needed to be accompanied by an adult. I found this double standard absurd and infuriating, unjust and illogical, and I regularly delivered diatribes to make my point. In retrospect, I can reconstruct my mother's thinking, though she never articulated her reasoning. She saw the world as a dangerous place for women, for their bodies and their reputations. What might happen to a lone young female if she were stranded on the roadside in our rural county after dark? My mother had grown up in New Jersey countryside in a nearly all-white world, yet now she lived in a Virginia county where nearly 1 in 5 inhabitants was Black. I am certain this enhanced her fears and her sense of urgency about protecting my white feminine purity. She regarded me as endangered in a way my brothers weren't, and she saw me as far more vulnerable than the boys to my own misjudgments. I had the capacity to get into trouble in a way that would be far more devastating for me than it could be for a boy. I did not share her anxieties, resented being cast as weak, and was angered by the lack of trust implicit in this policy. With my brother, I secretly, or not so secretly, evaded it whenever I could. The arguments I had with my mother were structured in a manner that meant they would almost certainly never be resolved. My mother often followed often unquestioned instincts. She felt more than she reasoned. I was the opposite, calling on all the intellectual power I could muster to offer what I believed to be irrefutable syllogisms to make my case. She wasn't interested. She would quickly anger and exert her authority. Because I said so, I would storm off and dissolve in frustrated tears. The outcome of this pattern was that I endeavored from a very young age to protect as much independence from my mother as I could, to preserve the freedom of action I could exercise when she simply did not know what I was up to. It was less about being sneaky or secretive than maintaining distance. In today's world, when college students call or text their parents multiple times a day, this seems unimaginable. But both technology and custom made relationships between parents and children quite different in mid-century America. When I went away to school, I phoned every other week. As I grew older, it became easier to maintain and even cultivate this distance. I remember discussing with a sympathetic advisor at my boarding school how I could manage to go home as infrequently as possible. And by the time I got to college at Bryn Mawr, I had the institution with its feminist traditions and commitment to student self-governance firmly on my side. In the winter of my first year at Bryn Mawr, I received a summons to meet with the dean, the indomitable Mary Patterson McPherson, whose 6 feet 2 inches of height made her physical presence as impressive as her intellect. I was worried about what I might have done to receive this call to her office, but I could never have imagined what Miss McPherson was about to report. Without telling me, my mother had driven up from Virginia the day before in order to express to the dean her worries about my recently acquired boyfriend and what she feared was my sex life. She hoped to enlist Miss McPherson on her side of our long-standing battle. Bryn Mawr permitted us to sign out any night until 2 a.m. Chaperones were a long, abandoned relic of the past. Miss McPherson explained to my mother that the college believed in entrusting its students with responsibility for their own lives, and that she would, of course, be informing me of her visit and her concerns. My mother had returned to Virginia without ever confessing she had been there. She never mentioned the trip to me afterward, and I saw no point in bringing it up. I cannot remember what I might have said to the dean in my astonishment, but as I listened to her words, I knew the college was on my side, neither in favor of nor opposed to the boyfriend, but in full support of my ability and right to figure it out for myself. I was free, and the long fight with my mother, even though there might be a few further skirmishes, I had won. Almost exactly 2 years later, she was dead. How can I understand my mother's life? Her inability to respond to change seems to be the heart of the matter. It was as if she could not see to move beyond the assumptions of a lost and for her far happier world. She thought it her obligation to teach me to be a lady, complete with the simultaneous privilege and subordination that destiny entailed. Education has been so important in enabling me to examine my own life and alter its contours and possibilities. I cannot help but think that my mother's lack of education and capacity for systematic self-reflection did much to imprison her within a set of expectations that she could neither change nor realize. But education for girls was little valued in her era. In 1950, only 1 in 3 white women over 25 had completed high school, and only 1 in 20 had completed college. Even if she had been more successful in school, it was unlikely she would have continued on to higher education. Similarly, young women of her social station rarely took on remunerative work and certainly did not anticipate or pursue careers. Motherhood was the undertaking for which her circumstances designated her. Whatever her advantages of class and wealth, she could not evade the constraints that her era's gender expectations placed upon her. Instead, she embraced much of the ideology of the 1950s with ferocity. Yet the very ferocity with which she defended the strictures of 1950s womanhood was paradoxical. She had no patience for what she called helpless women who waited for men to open doors or carry heavy packages. After all, she could bend a 1,000-pound horse to her will. Her incessant, hard-fought arguments with my father showed her to be anything but docile or differential. Yet she neither doubted nor challenged the reality that it was a man's world. Few could have done better at achieving what Diane called the forfeited self. She would live through her children even as they struggled to escape her control. Her death at age 48 was a final act of self-abnegation. That is the end of the first chapter of the memoir. And it's an interesting memoir in that it ends with her graduation from Bryn Mawr, not her professional life. Gilpin Faust evidently felt that her identity had been fully formed by the time she was 22 or 23 years old, and that whatever her mother believed, her life proved that this was a woman's world after all. Thank you. I don't know how to shut this.